Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest in a series of webinars facilitated by the RTD Technical Interest Group of the American Evaluation Association. My name is Gavin Reddick, and I'm the program co-chair of the TIG. And the webinar today is on DARE, the Diversity Approach to Research Evaluation. And we're going to hear a presentation from Frederique Bone, Michael Hopkins, and Joshua Moon, all of the University of Sussex. So this is an academic project that they've been working on for some time, and I'm going to let them talk to you about it. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available afterwards, along with slides and materials. In terms of the format, the speakers will present, and then we'll have a good chunk of time for questions and discussion at the end. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Michael Hopkins.
Thank you very much, Gavin, and thank you to everybody for joining us. We are presenting, as Gavin said, a new approach for research evaluation, the diversity approach to research evaluation. My background is that I was a long time ago a biologist, and subsequently been working in science technology policy at the University of Sussex in the Science Policy Research Unit there. So I have a long-standing interest in medical innovation, looking at the emergence of new technologies into clinical use, but also alongside that an interest in research evaluation, in particular, looking at collaborative research, whether that's within academia or interdisciplinary research, or research initiatives that span boundaries, like between academia and the clinic, or academia and industry. So this particular project is an attempt to find a new way to study collaborative research and to understand what is going on within collaborative research projects and what can help to make those productive interactions. This particular project is funded by the Wellcome Trust, and it's part of their research on research program, which is, I guess, in other places might be called Science of Science or Science of Science Policy. And even before that, we might have just called it Science Policy. And what we're aiming to do within this study is to present DARE to a number of different audiences: research evaluators, research managers, researchers themselves, funders, and really give them an opportunity to see what DARE is and how it works, and then to make suggestions how we could make it relevant for their interests, and hopefully make DARE something which can be applied more widely. So that's why we're doing seminars such as this. We've done quite a number in the UK, and we're delighted to be able to reach out to a wide audience through this seminar today. And we're really keen to present, hopefully to give you an opportunity to ask questions, to clarify what DARE is about, and to engage in ways in which we can improve our approach and the tools, and help to make it more useful. So we're very keen to have a wide-ranging discussion. This is part of a live research project. So what we're doing is we are collecting your thoughts, but it is collected in an anonymous way, and we are not going to quote anybody here in a way which is attributed. And at the end of the session, we're going to provide you with a link to a questionnaire, which will probably take about 10 minutes to complete, and we'd be delighted if people can, again, complete that anonymously if they wish to. You can put your contact details at the end of the questionnaire if you want to stay in touch and receive updates in the future development of DARE. So with all that said, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Frederique Bone, who's been really the core developer of the technical approach here that supports DARE. So I'll hand over to you, Frederique.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you, Gavin, for inviting us to present DARE. So maybe the first question to ask about DARE and why do we need a new methods for research evaluation, or what really is new about DARE, because we have been doing research evaluation for a while, so why do we need a new tool or new method to do research evaluation? So in a nutshell, why did DARE come about and what are we trying to do with DARE? So as Michael was saying, there is a method to understand research collaboration, and we think that this is increasingly important because researchers work in larger and larger teams and also more complex teams. So when we talk about the diversity approach, we really mean that we want to understand the differences in background of people along many dimensions. And because research teams become more and more complex, this is really key in order to understand how people do research. Also, research evaluation has traditionally looked at outputs. So we've been counting publications, patents, spin-out companies, and so on and so forth. But the problem is that different research teams might have a different pace at which they can produce outputs. And if teams are very different and complex, it might be harder for them to produce outputs in a timely manner. So it's not really fair to compare teams with one another because they have many underlying differences. And this is why Razor want to focus on research processes. We want to understand how people collaborate rather than looking at output per se, because we think we have a good way to look at outputs, but if we look at processes, we can gain further understanding about how collaboration works and also how collaboration might lead to desirable outputs. So there is a tool and has been developed to provide an understanding about variety in team composition. So I will talk further about that. So how can we characterize variety, diversity, or differences within team composition? And that might involve many dimensions. We also want to understand how researchers work with one another. And in research collaboration, this means working with other researchers, but also a much wider variety of stakeholders. And also we aim at understanding research processes. So we think that understanding research processes and how collaboration unfolds might help us to understand how outcomes may arise. So that's the ground or the basis in our development of DARE. So now I'm going to move to the presentation of the method and what the method is trying to achieve. So overall, in order to understand the diversity of a research team, we want to show the contribution of a research collaboration, and we want to understand how diverse is a team behind an initiative. So by initiative, usually here we mean like a funded research project. And diversity might imply two things. First, that if you have a diverse team, it might mean that there's quite a few challenges to be overcome for people to work together. However, we also see diversity as beneficial. So many research funders and research managers seem to think that team with people of diverse background might be beneficial for work, for knowledge production, and for innovation. So it's quite important to look at diversity. So diversity can take a large number of dimensions. And as a starting point of this project, we based our work on previous work in economic geography, which aimed at looking at main dimension of interactive learning. This dimension might not be the sole dimension in which we might be interested to look at diversity, but in our project, this was our starting point. So we took these 5 dimensions of diversity to understand how people might be different from one another. And in this literature, this might mean that if you have some diversity along those dimensions, this might help you to have innovation, interactive learning, and interesting knowledge production. So I'll give you a brief overview of what these 5 dimensions mean. So first of all, you have the cognitive dimension, which are differences of background or knowledge bases of individuals within research teams. And this usually is in the literature tagged as interdisciplinarity. So it might be a bit more complex than that, but that entails also looking at how people from different disciplines might collaborate together. So we also include the geographic dimensions, so looking at where people are located and how they collaborate across these locations. Thirdly, we look at the social dimension, which usually involves trust. So if you have a relationship of trust, or if you know one another and you have experience of working together, it might be easier to work together. We also look at the institutional dimension, which is really about what incentive structure are you under? So what does your institution or your work environment incentivize you to do? And finally, organizational is about hierarchies. So if you're under the same hierarchy and the same structure, it might be relatively easier to collaborate with one another. So those are our 5 starting dimensions, which we started to build there on. So there really builds on mapping research teams. So we use maps, indicators and narratives, but the mapping element is probably the newest element of the method, so we put a bit more emphasis on that. So we will present each of the dimensions in different maps, and in this presentation we use an example project, which is a collaboration to understand the cause of a neglected disease. So on the right side you can see the map of collaborator, where circles represent individuals taking part in the collaboration. You can see that some circles have different sizes. So the size represents the level of involvement. So a big circle means people have been involved in the proposal, they're paid by the project, and they have a good part of involvement in the organization or work carried out within the project. However, when we did collect our data, we found that there is a wide range of people supporting that research, which might be involved, who might be involved in training, who might be involved in discussion around methods, technique, but who aren't really parts of the research project formally. So these have been acknowledged in smaller circles, but they're also shown as part of the team. And to be able to track people across maps, we colored them according to their own organization. So if you have like the green people are from the same organization. So that's just a way to visually see and track people along those different dimensions. So if we take the example, if we start with a geographic dimension and we would ask, what is the geographical breadth or diversity of the collaboration? We would measure the physical distance between the work location of collaborator, or here especially we look at how long it takes to travel from one place to another. So for each pair of individual, we look at how long it would take them to travel to the other person's working place. And then that would enable us to get that map and that distribution within the map. And behind that, we can see that we map people who are located very close to one another or in the same department or the same university as a distance of 0 and 5 or 1 or 5. So they'd be pictured very close to one another. But if they be in a different continent, they'd be actually plotted very far from one another. And that enables to have a nice clustering of individuals, because each pairs and putting distances between each pair enables that clustering. So we can see 3 clusters, which would actually represent the work location of the different people. So here we have the main team is in Europe and especially in the UK. We have some people working in the States and also some people in Africa. And in Africa, you can see 2 clusters, which represent 2 different countries in Africa. And even within one specific country, they work in different cities, which are not that accessible to one another. So you can see distances between them. And because there is a wide range of people across a number of continents, the diversity of that research team can be considered as quite high. So once we looked at the diversity of the research team, so here for the geographical dimension, we can look at how much the initiative has helped bridge the identified diversity. So how much interaction has been achieved as a result of the research projects. And we use the cohesiveness measure to look at that, and in a dynamic way. So we want to look at what was the pre-existing interaction between people in the team, and what are the interaction that was achieved after the initiative started. So if we take the same map that we use for diversity here, and we ask what is the bridging effort existing before the collaboration, we can overlay how intensely people collaborated or individuals collaborated before the research project started. So if there was no meeting, there wouldn't be any lines between collaborators. If they would have met maybe once a year before the collaboration started, they would have a faded line, so a very low intensity line. But if they had daily meetings, they would have a very intense or thick line representing one another. And the advantage of plotting both the diversity and the interaction, you can see, it's more visible, the interaction that bridge people who are very different. So I think that's what the mapping helps you to see. So you can see that there is already some interaction existing between Europe and the States before the collaboration. But then what you can do, you can map the bridging effort realized after the collaboration, and comparing before and after, you can see what has been realized as a result of the project. So there is many new links that appear between the States and Africa, and UK and Africa, but relatively less or almost no link between the two African countries. So that's one of the results of the project. So the cohesiveness has increased as a result of the collaboration. So this captures a dynamic record of the collaboration in which the diversity really represents a landscaping exercise at the outset of the initiative, and the cohesiveness represents the changes achieved as a result of the research project. So now we've looked at the geographic dimension, but we can look at many other dimensions of diversity. So if we take the cognitive dimension, which represents interdisciplinarity or difference of knowledge bases between the collaborator, we see a very different picture. So people who were close to one another, for instance, the blue dots, now appear quite different from one another. And in this collaboration, we had a cluster who were working more on earth science. So they were doing soil mapping, because the soil, like the interaction with soil, would have a triggering of the neglected disease, and some would work more on the genetic determinant of the disease. So this project brings two disciplines, and they would work together in one research project. And the disciplines, or how we plotted the individuals or the team, is based on bibliographic information. So we took their publication data and we look at which journal they cited. And so by having those citations, we can look at how similar are the citation patterns between two individuals, taking into account that if a journal is in the same, if two journals are in the same field, they're quite similar to one another. So we can compare to a kind of high level of granularity how different people are from one another. So if we move to the institutional dimension, which refers to the difference in norms, rules, and value and incentives that the different collaborators are accustomed to, we can see that in this collaboration, we had many people working as researchers within university, but also researchers within university hospitals. We had a few more people working as clinicians within university hospitals, and governmental organization and non-governmental organization. I want to say that here, for instance, there could be a further category which would represent industry, but this wasn't, in this particular collaboration, industry wasn't represented, so it wouldn't be part of the map. And how we decide on how close or distant the different group would be is depending whether they incentivize in terms of having care for patients, whether they pushed for open science or publishing, whether they have more commercial intentions, so industry would have a more commercial spin, or whether they're more policy oriented. So here this project is not that diverse in terms of institution, because most of the people would be clustered in open science and research incentives. So moving on to the fourth dimension, which is the organizational dimension, and which differs from the institutional dimension, because this is really about hierarchical structure and how easy it might be to work with someone within your own department compared to working with somebody external where you have to draw up contracts or have to have a more formal link with them. So the institutional one, which is more about incentive structure, and the organizational one is more about hierarchies. And this has a simple clustering where people would be clustered together if they're in the same departments or center, somehow clustered if they're in the same organization, or far apart if they're in different organizations. And here we have a high number of organizations, which makes a quite high diversity. However, on the map, you can see that 3 organizations are clustered together, and this is due to a few people having double affiliation or visiting affiliation between organizations, which then makes this organization closer on the mapping. So finally, the last dimension refers to the social dimension, and this really maps how well collaborators knew one another before the start of the project. So in this final map, we looked at whether people have worked together before, whether they knew each other before or didn't know each other before at all. So in this collaboration, there's a few people who knew one another and worked together at the outset of the project, which is represented in the core team. But here you can see all the people who didn't meet anyone from the core project at the outset of the project. So that collaboration involved quite a number of new people within that collaboration. So I just want to make a final point about data collection. So for this project and this representation, we used 8 case studies, which we showed you one pilot case study, and we based most of the data on interview data. So we went and interviewed people. In half of the cases, we sat down with them and they produced their own map of who was involved in the project, how they interacted. So we showed you the maps and the indicator, but really when we're collecting data about research project, we aim at understanding how people work together with maps and indicators and how they bridge diversity, but using narratives is also an important part. So we also collect narrative about why, how difficult it has been to bridge some of the differences, why it has been important, and what outcome it has led to. So for instance, in this map, you can see the red or the purple, which are further projects which spun out of the existing project that we studied. So this is also the kind of data that we collect through there. So in conclusion, there brings early insights on understanding the underlying characteristic of the team. And why should we be interested in diversity? First of all, because diversity might be desired by design. So there's some problems that might require more than one discipline, people coming together from different geography, but we can imagine many other dimensions which might be helpful to represent as diversity. But diversity is also a barrier to overcome. So it might be quite difficult or take quite some time for people to be able to work together in a diverse team. So we think that the combination of there with output related measure can help us really to understand whether encouraging certain types of diversity might improve desirable outcome that research manager or research funders may have. So that's the main presentation. So I guess I wanted to share with you the website, which you can, on the website, you can look at maps and interactive maps if you want to see the case and before and after. And I might take questions on the methods before moving on to points of discussion. So thanks.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. So does anybody have any questions on the methods that Frederique has outlined here? You could type that in the chat or raise a hand, or you have the ability to unmute yourself and ask a question if you prefer. So I'm going to ask a question on the methodology. So you outlined a number of different dimensions that you currently incorporate. As you've been working through for a little while, have you found it that those dimensions encompass all of the information that you think is important in terms of classifying that diversity? Or as you've been going through, do you find yourself having to shoehorn different dimensions within that? So have you got at the start of your thinking potential other dimensions that you might want to explore in future?
So that's a very good question, and there is many other dimensions that we think might be important, but because that's the next part of the discussion, we don't want to lead the discussion to something we think might be important, and we'd rather hear from people what they think is important. So that's the next part of the discussion. So I don't really want to answer to that now, if that's okay. I'd rather discuss it and then maybe at the end talk about it, but I'd rather keep the discussion for people to tell us what they think is important, to not lead the discussion to what we think might be important. That's okay. Michael, do you want to say anything?
No, thank you, Freddie. I just wanted to mention that there's a question in the chat that we can give a more straightforward answer to. The question is about the social dimension and how that's determined, and do we interview all participants? I'll take the last part, Freddie, if you want to do the first part. So the question on whether we interview all participants, of course, it would be possible to interview all participants involved in a research study. This was a pilot, and what we did was we began by interviewing the principal investigator, and they recommended to us some colleagues that we could interview. We spoke to the main postdoc involved in the project and a couple of other people who are very key, and we drew up the maps on that basis. However, we do know that for the maps to be of highest accuracy, really you would want to interview everybody, but interviews take time, and also you need to be able to access those different interviewees and to have them give your time. So really, to do something like that, I think you would probably need the support of a funder to do it comprehensively. But you know, I think you get a lot of the detail, and you can do more and more interviews, but you get diminishing returns. You'll find less new information out for each interview that you undertake. So in this particular case, I think we did 4 interviews, and the project has something like about 30 participants. 5 interviews and about 30 participants, or maybe more. Okay, Freddie, how do we determine the social dimension?
So theoretically, the social dimension is more about trust, but in interview, we found it very difficult to ask people whether they trusted other people in the team. So as a best proxy, and this has been done in network analysis quite a lot by Bert and another, we looked at whether people have worked together before, and we assume that if people have worked together and they want to sustain that relationship, that this is a good signal that people are inclined to trust and work with one another. So it's a very rough estimate in how we proxy that. So we first asked whether they knew one another. So some people didn't know each other at all. So we asked them whether they knew everybody else on in the project. If they have met at conferences before or somewhere they've been introduced, then they would have a kind of intermediate proximity. And if they worked together before, then we assume that they've been very proximate because they used to work with one another, and then it wouldn't be any cost for them to work together again because they would know how to collaborate. So that's how we operationalize the social dimension, if that makes sense.
I'll just add to that the 5 dimensions that we presented today are each characterized in a slightly different way. In the case of the cognitive dimension, there is a pre-existing method that we could use that had been published and used in various other studies by other authors. So we could just sort of take that off the shelf, as it were, and operationalize it in this case with people who are publishing work that cites a similar body of prior literature being more proximate to each other than people who cite very different literatures indicating that they're working in different disciplines. And with that, you know, we're relying on Web of Science data, and there you have reference data of millions of publications that can tell you how frequently it is that people in chemistry collaborate with people in biochemistry or biology or clinical sciences. So from that basis, you can say this is a very common relationship, and it's not as extraordinary as, for example, a relationship where you have a physicist or an astrophysicist working with historians or lawyers. It's comparatively more rarely seen. But in the other dimensions, we don't have those full reference sets. With geography, obviously, we do have a fairly good idea where every city or town is, where collaborators may come from. We can calculate travel distances and so on. But in dimensions like the social and the institutional and the organizational, the scales that we're using are not as well defined. They're not as fine-grained because we don't think that we've got an evidence base behind us to say whether one increment or another is the right one to use to describe that relationship. So these are sort of rough guides that do provide some granularity and can show some differences. But you know, one of the things with the dimensions is we would like to have more reference data to sit behind them to make the scales more meaningful.
So I got another question in the chat. So how do you see the result of this early analysis influencing the course of the research? Michael, you want to take that one? It's a bold question.
Sure. Well, I mean, one thing clearly is we're looking at different ways of using these dimensions, better ways of using scales, better additional dimensions, which of course is part of the discussion today, hopefully. So there may be some things that funders and researchers think are important and influential to research collaborations, which are not currently in these 5 dimensions. And as Freddie suggested, these 5 dimensions come from the work of Boshemer, and they suggest that these are dimensions which are influential in knowledge creation and knowledge exchange. And so we thought we'd try and apply those, but of course there could be others. And what we're doing here as well is we're finding a new way of visualizing and analyzing interactions that occur during a research project. In a sense, what we're doing is we're finding a new way of putting a team of collaborating scientists under a microscope and visualizing what it is that they do. But what we can't yet say is whether one type of collaboration or another type of collaboration looks like, you know, from the pattern of linkages that we're identifying, looks like it's going to be more productive or not. You know, that really is something that has to be studied in many different projects before we can start to say the particular patterns of interactions are necessary or helpful in producing particular types of outputs. So that is another part of what we want to do, is more case studies, look at more projects to try and understand more about how, for example, in a very diverse team, maybe the pattern of interactions needs to be more intense or go on for longer before you can get outputs. So, for example, we already know from prior research, people report that interdisciplinary projects, it takes a while for people to learn to kind of speak the same language or a common language, and that can mean that it takes longer to produce results.
If I can add on that, what I find quite interesting is also to understand how the different dimensions interact. So we're able to characterize better diversity. So if there is different diversity to teams, so teams can be very diverse cognitively, but maybe other dimension can help to make the collaboration easier if they might be more proximate in other dimensions. So it might also be interesting to see how much diversity in how many dimensions might make the work too difficult, or what would be the prerequisite for it to make it work. So there is, in many different settings, you might want different type of diversity. So for instance, if you're funding development, you want collaborating between different geography to come together. So maybe the question then is it helpful to have also cognitive diversity and other types of diversity or proximity, or not, to enable a smooth collaboration or something that might not be too difficult? So we have a question whether we measure factor of cultural and language diversity. So I think, Michael, if you think we can maybe move to the second, because I think Gavin started asking that question, and I think we want really to have the discussion about what dimension would be helpful, and that's really where we'd like to go or think about. So we'd like to have a discussion about which dimension you think might be helpful, whether the one that we have that we took from literature are helpful or not, and whether additional dimension might be important to record. So for instance, you mentioned cultural and language diversity, so these might be important to record because there might be barrier for people to collaborate to one another, and dimension which you think might be influential to get some types of outcomes. So it might be interesting to incorporate a citation analysis, find out who is citing the research. This could inform future collaboration that could be productive. Could you talk to that maybe, to make sure I understand what you're suggesting, if that's okay?
Hi, yeah, no, that's fine. I was thinking that, you know, maybe there's pieces that a collaborative team had been missing, that, you know, they're not aware of who's using their research, and it could broaden the collaborations even more to, you know, do sort of an after the fact analysis of adding in this extra piece of who's really looking at this, who's really using our data, and that could inform for future collaborations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So it's really about seeing almost the next steps once you produce the research, who is using the research, and how could we help shape future collaboration depending on who is interested in the work and might build on the work. So that's almost a next iteration about shaping collaboration, right?
Yeah, exactly. You could really, you know, inform people in, you know, in a way that it might be hard for them to go back and collect these data, but you've already got the upfront analysis, and then adding this, you know, citation analysis or some kind of analysis like that. I don't know if that's the best metric, but something to to say, where is this research going? Because sometimes people see things that are in fields far away that you wouldn't necessarily make that connection.
And if they're citing the work, that might also imply that they're interested and already make a step towards engaging with that research. Right. That's an interesting point. I think that's going more towards a helpful application of DARE, how the method could be developed to be used by research manager or other actors within the research ecosystem to shape collaboration and think about how people can connect in a more informed way. That's a good suggestion. Thank you very much.
So and the other, I'm going to put this in the chat, but I heard a talk the other day by a researcher at UC San Francisco named Nevin Krogan, and he's deep into the COVID research, and they're developing, potential drug targets, identifying potential drug targets of drugs that already exist. And the point of his talk was, the science part, but also at the end, he talked about the silos. So in the course of this, over the last couple months, they developed a whole bunch of plasmids. They sent them to 342 different labs around the world. They didn't patent anything. They're making all the results transparent, freely available. And his whole point was to cut down on the silos and the barriers that we put up to help, they're natural things because everyone wants credit for their work. I'm not saying it's an evil thing, but it is a side effect of the way we work that we end up being very siloed. And so he might, I'll put that in the chat for everyone, but I found the science was very compelling, but I also found his philosophy of sharing and breaking down silos very compelling. And you might want to see if you can get hold of that slide. It was internal to NIH, so I don't have the slides myself. It was just on a video cast, but you might want to talk to him and you've got a lot of, what I was thinking is you've got a lot of natural experiments going on right now with this COVID thing that are definitely breaking down barriers and increasing the diversity of the collaborations.
Definitely. Michael, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I mean, that it demonstrates the importance of capturing some of the narrative that's going around research. So you can imagine that individual obviously is spurring potential collaborations, sharing materials, having a mindset that there are particular practices that they can follow to increase the transfer of their knowledge, and that may in time be associated with more citations to their work or an increase in collaborative opportunities for that individual. And so you could track that activity through DARE, but you could see it perhaps in the maps and the measures, but you need the narrative element to understand what were the practices that they were using, what were the norms that they were applying, which then after time you could say led to their project having a particular impact.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities could come out of this. Thank you for your very interesting and beautifully done presentation. Very impressive graphics. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We got Gavin.
Yeah, so I was going to say that there's some more questions in the chat. So obviously I want to hear the answer to my question, but I don't need to exercise that prerogative quite yet. But question, do you consider ethnic and gender diversity that could also have an impact on cognitive diversity? So that gets into the additional dimensions component. And then also a really helpful comment from Holly that gender data for authors, so if you were to look at that, it is now available via the ICSR lab, and there is no cost to access it as well, so which is a really good tip there, and Holly's helpfully put the link in as well if you want to explore. So could you comment on ethnic and gender diversity and around cognitive diversity as well?
Certainly. So we haven't so far. As I said, we started with 5 dimensions. Those come from the literature, and we would expect those to have some influence on the ease of knowledge production and the how productive the interactions are. You can easily imagine a scenario in which a team of researchers is brought together on a project and they didn't know each other before, and they're geographically separated by quite some way, that they're working in different organizations with different institutional drivers or different constraints, and they might be from very different disciplines, and I've forgotten which was the fifth one I haven't mentioned, but you can imagine they can be different in different dimensions. That makes it really difficult to collaborate, and funders might be wondering how they can best balance these things so that they don't support projects which are unlikely to go forward. But then there are other dimensions where you say, well, I'm not really convinced that these elements are going to necessarily impact the productivity of the project, but I'd like to have them measured anyway because they're important for different reasons, not necessarily associated with productivity, but they might simply be something that we want to encourage because we want to have more inclusion. So we hadn't looked at gender or ethnic background, for example, before, but it may well be that researchers, funders, others think that those things should be put into the map so that we can see. For example, it might be, well, it might simply be wanting to make sure that projects are more, the teams are more representative of society rather than a particular group. And we would obviously include those if that's what people think we should be doing. And what we're keen to do is to develop the approach so that more dimensions are available and they can be put into the mix where people want to apply the tool.
Yes, maybe just to be clear, because as Michael was saying at the beginning of the presentation, this project is really much in the running, and one of the main questions is which dimension we would like to add. And many of the one which was mentioned in the chat have been suggested to us, but that's why we really encourage you to fill in the survey, because we're gathering the data of the survey to actually see what different people think might be very important for us to develop next. So that will enable us to develop a list of dimensions which might be interesting, and the one most people think are important would be the one that we operationalize next. But maybe one important part is also as well to say that we try to develop there with this 5 dimensions, not saying that these 5 dimensions are the most important, but just as a way to trial how we can define a dimension, decide or operationalize different category, assigning distances to do some mapping. So behind there is a way to operationalize any dimension that you might think of to capture diversity and to map diversity of teams. So if you can imagine any dimension and have a way to think about how would you define categories, and if you could put a number in saying this category is different to this other category to that number, then you can produce maps and indicators for there. And this is, this is a method which we operationalize on a number of dimensions, but I guess we all be very happy if others would take the principle and apply it with different dimensions. So we plan definitely to have more dimensions. And I think that having already gender data or some kind of operationalization helpful to move there forward and have more dimension for people to use. But definitely, I think there is many different aspects of diversity which would need to be tackled. But the main problem is about how do you define these categories and these boundaries, and that might be maybe straightforward, but maybe delicate. So when we discussed before within the team about gender diversity, you might have gender in a binary way, but that might not be very satisfactory for a number of people as well. So there might be complexity in operationalizing each of the characteristics depending on what you'd like to measure and where you want to go with it. If that makes sense.
I should also add that the work that we've done so far has been accepted for publication in the journal Research Evaluation, and there is already a full version of that paper which went into the SPRU working paper series. And if anybody's interested, or maybe perhaps Freddie or Josh, we could put that into the chat, put a link to that so people can see the full paper which supports what we've been talking about today.
Yes, and I also included the link to the working paper as part of the TIG email that included the information on this event. So if you received the email, which I think most people here probably will have done, you can also find the link in that email. I do have a question. I'm conscious of time, but so I've got the sort of the next one, which you don't need to pick on because we've talked about some potential dimensions in different ways. But I've got a question about practicality and scaling. So say we can conclude from this that we can understand a number of these different dimensions that are of themselves interesting, but also ultimately potentially predictive, and that those might form the basis of policy incentives to try and improve some of those diversity around some of those dimensions. From everything you said so far, in terms of the restrictions around interviewing people and some of the practicalities involved, how do you see, or how are you currently thinking about scaling? So we've had some comments on bibliometrics and some of the characteristics that are available there. Are you thinking of moving in that direction? Because if it works really well, but it can only really work very labor intensively on a small number of cases, then it probably isn't necessarily so practical.
Sure. So first of all, as Freddie was saying, we've begun to use this approach through interviews, and those interviews have usually involved sitting down with people across the table and giving them a piece of paper and some coloured pens and asking them to literally talk about their collaboration and who was involved, and to, in a way which is appropriate for them, to just literally sketch out who was where and how they worked together. And we found that these sort of sketch maps, as we called them, have been really important, because when people are talking about collaboration which involves lots of different people, you kind of need to have that sketched out in front of you and point with your finger, you know, what about this person? You've told me that these people were new people that you hadn't worked with before, but what about this person over here? Did you know that? And did A know B? And did B know C? And did, you know, D and E also know A? So you have to have some way of allowing the conversation, which is already a narrative as well, to incorporate these different, to incorporate a discussion about how each person is linked to each other person. And so we thought, well, okay, you can have these long open interviews to begin with, but once you kind of know who you're expecting to be in the collaboration, then you can turn that into a form or a questionnaire, which you can then do follow-up interviews with people who are perhaps more peripheral in the project, maybe less involved, and you can have a shorter form of interview to get to them. It may be that you can ultimately, if you were doing a series of catch-ups with individuals within a team, say an online report that a funder might require, you're doing that more regularly, then you might be able to break down more complex interactions into a series of short reports. But ultimately, what you really need to get to for this, for our method, is you need to know how frequently people are interacting with each other. And so that's the core of it. If you can find a way of doing that without interviews, then perhaps that might have a beneficial effect from the scale up. But you need to be able to ask people who are you working with and how often were you working with those people, and to understand something about the quality of those interactions. And of course, the narrative that you get from the interviews is really important. So I think that maybe this is an approach that you don't use for every research project, but if you're trying something new, or you have a particularly important program, you might want to invest in the time to do some detailed interviews and really understand what's going on in particular projects. But we are talking about, for the short interviews, maybe 45 minutes to an hour. For the longer interviews with the more core members of the team, it might be an hour and a half or 2 hours in some cases. That's what we found so far. You might be able to reduce that a bit by making some sort of a form to guide the discussion, which we have been trying to use, especially now we can't do face-to-face interviews as easily. We're trying to create a software interface to collect the data a bit more easily. But I think with a bit of user experience and maybe some more slick interfaces, we might be able to make the data gathering a bit more streamlined.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. And we're almost exactly at time. Do you have any 30-second final closing comments, requests?
Well,
go ahead, Fred.
Well, first of all, maybe Josh can put the link to the thing in the chat. So maybe I can jump in on maybe 10 seconds to show a slide. Does that work? So that's a backup slide on if you do only use publication data or interview data, how different would your network look like? And you might miss a lot of people using publication data compared to interview data. So there is a trade-off. So I think there's some things you could do with secondary data. So looking at diversities, interaction might be more difficult. But if you look at secondary data, you might get a different view of what a collaboration is, and all the people who might not be formally recognized might not feature on the method or when you do maps. So I think overall, we hope that there might be a good way to map diversities and interaction. You might be able to think about ways, different data to use to map these, but overall there might be trade-off in using different types of data to do different maps, and what you capture might be very different from one another. That makes sense.
Yes, brilliant, and a really nice slide. Thank you very much. So I'd like to say thank you to Michael, Frederique, and Josh for coming and talking today. We're out of time, and I can see people are leaving. So thank you very much for joining us as well. And I would say that the next webinar in the series will be at 10 a.m. Eastern on Thursday, October the 6th, and it will be on evaluation training needs and developing evaluation capacity. So we'll make the slides available, and so you'll see an email about that, but it will appear in the channel we have with all of the webinars in this series.
And please fill in the survey. Please fill in the survey. It only takes 10 minutes, and it may well change what we do next.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, and I hope you have a great day. And thanks again for the presenters for doing an excellent job and presenting a really thoughtful presentation. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.